Hey listeners, let me apologize for the sound quality of this podcast because it isn't great. It's very clicky and poppy. If I had rewards to give out, I would give rewards to anyone who actually made it all the way through this episode. I just want to warn you ahead of time. If you survive these 18 minutes, you're my hero. And I promise that it'll be better next time. But that's kind of what happens when I repurpose audio from a couple of different sources. It may not always come across exactly like the original. And because this original it was long lost several months ago, there was really no way for me to go back and redo it really fast. But because of the way that some of my topics have built on each other, I couldn't just scrap it altogether. But in case you didn't know, at least on the Apple iTunes app, you can listen to it in fast speed, and maybe you can get it done in like 9 minutes instead of 18. Maybe other podcatcher apps and podcast listening apps will let you also do that, so you can get through it as fast as possible but still get the information that's there, because it's not terrible information, just the sound quality is pretty terrible. So I'm sorry. I hope you still love me. Good luck.
Nothing you're about to hear should be taken as or used in place of medical advice. If you resemble anything you hear, contact your doctor. If you want to know what Walgreens thinks, ask them, because we don't know. Please wait behind the line for privacy.
You're listening to the Pharmacist Answers podcast. I'm Cynthia the Pharmacist, and today you'll get your questions answered and your curiosity cured.
We're going to talk about hair. So today, we're just going to start with the basics. So where it is, how it works, how your body actually produces it for you. So my starting picture, I actually drew you a little diagram, but this is essentially what your hair looks like in your body. And as mammals, and in biology, one of the distinguishing characteristics of mammals is that we have hair all over our body. Now, humans being a little more evolutionarily developed, or however you want to look at it. So we have lots of kind of what we say hairless places on our body. There's still fuzz on places that don't look hairy like. So this layer right here, this is your skin, and all of this is happening underneath your skin. So we all have sweat glands in lots and lots of places. And then you have hair follicles. And the hair follicle, so this is your hair follicle, and attached to your hair follicle are your oil glands. And so all of this is happening underneath your skin. If you've ever had the sensation when they say you feel your hair stand up, adrenaline and certain other hormones in your body will cause this little muscle, which is called the Arrector pili muscle, because it makes your hair go erect. So adrenaline will usually do it. Some other hormones can do it to make all of those muscles contract at the same time, and that's what gives you that hair standing up feeling. Just a tidbit, your hair actually has muscles. Isn't that cool? You've got your hair follicle, and then the hair shaft, which is actually the part that comes out of the skin that you can see. So all of this is hair shaft, because you can see it. It's out of the body already. The other thing some people get distracted by or maybe confused by is that your hair actually grows from the bottom out. Your hair doesn't grow from the tip out. So all of this up here is actually dead, and it doesn't grow. It can still absorb moisture or lose moisture. That's why your hair can dry out, and that's why some people may do conditioning or certain oil treatments. And then because it's also made of proteins, then things like hair coloring or perm treatments actually change the proteins that are here, because proteins in themselves aren't living, so they can, as long as they don't get completely mutilated, they can stick around and they can be detached and reattached and things, and that's how you can go from having straight hair to curly hair until the hair falls off kind of thing with a perm, or vice versa, doing curly hair to straight hair in that permanent treatment at a salon or something. Your hair, the protein that your hair is made out of is called keratin. Keratin is a fibrous protein. The two main types of protein that we talk about in biology is fibrous proteins and globular proteins. And so they look just like they sound. Globular protein looks like a glob. It's basically like all twisted up and connected back to itself like a glob. Fibrous proteins are a little more organized and they look like fibers. So keratin is a fibrous protein, so it arranges itself in a nice little string, and then when they get together, in like nice little bundles, so they're all nice and organized. So then keratin, your cells make keratin close to the end of their life cycle. So then cells will actually go through a process called cornification. And it's basically when the cell is at the end of its life cycle and it fills up with keratin and becomes really hard. So if you don't do a good job of exfoliating your skin, then you can get like those really dry patches. There's a certain skin condition that is caused by an overproduction of the keratin. And so you have to use like really abrasive exfoliants to be able to get those dead layers off, because that keratin builds up so fast. Keratin is the thing that your body makes to grow your hair and to grow your fingernails. And so when the top layer of the cell starts to reach the end of its life cycle, it fills up with keratin and becomes really hard. So for your nails, fingernails are kind of a primitive tool for us to use. It also gives protection to the skin underneath that would be more tender as you use your hands. So that's why it's really hard. And then with your hair, the hair follicle here, this little section I blocked off called the bulb, this is actually full of living cells, and it has a nice little capillary bed that feeds it nutrients and takes away the waste. And the cells in that little bulb, they will multiply or divide themselves to multiply once every 23 to 72 hours. What determines how fast it's going to multiply? Sometimes it's age. Sometimes it's if you're nutrient deficient, then that cell reproduction will slow down. Sometimes it's just genetics. Some people just have genetically slow growing hair. So the cells in this area are actually dividing and multiplying and being fed nutrients from your bloodstream and then sending its waste out to get rid of. But then as the cells in here reach the end of its life cycle, they will fill up with keratin. And then as the newer cells keep dividing, then it pushes those dead cells out. And because of the shape of it, it keeps it in a nice little tubular shape. So it keeps connecting. So again, the cells out here that we see, these are dead cells. But the cells deep inside are still living. So your hair grows from the bottom up. And your body has two types of keratin, because obviously your hair doesn't feel the same way that your fingernails do. So there's two types of keratin that your body makes. One is called alpha keratin, the other one is beta keratin. And this is not to be confused with beta carotene, which is a vitamin like carrots and like good for your eyes, that kind of thing. Not the same thing. They sound the same, but not the same. Your fingernails are beta, and it's much harder. Your hair is alpha keratin, and it's softer and more flexible. So you couldn't imagine like having really flexible keratin on your fingers. Like that would be weird. So as the cells start to die and they fill up with keratin, then the shape of the hair follicle smushes them together in a nice little tube to make your hair. One of the interesting things is that depending on the health of these cells in here as they go through their life cycle is going to determine the health of the hair as it goes out here. So if these cells aren't very healthy, and so that means their connections aren't very good and they didn't have all of the nutrients that they needed throughout their life, then as their skeletons make it out here, then they're not going to stay well connected. And that's why you can have breakage of the hair, because those connections just couldn't handle the stress of them being outside of your body. Oh, curly versus straight. The shape of this follicle is what determines whether your hair is straight or curly. Obviously, genetics is going to determine what shape your hair follicles are, but if the hair follicle is asymmetrical or maybe oval shaped, why does hair go gray? That's a good question. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. I'm going to talk about curly and straight, and then I'm going to talk about color. If you actually looked at a top view to look down into the hole that the hair is coming out of, If it's perfectly symmetrical in a circle, then the hair is going to be straight, because that means that all of the proteins, as they're packing into each other, are being evenly stacked. If the hair follicle is oblong or oval shaped, then that's going to make the hair curly, because then the proteins aren't necessarily going to stack straight. They may stack lopsided. So if you think about, if you've ever tried to stack like 3-ring binders, so one end of the 3-ring binder is thick because that's where the rings are and they're not flexible, but then the other end, if it's empty, then the other end is like really close, so it kind of makes a triangle. If you try to stack them all in one direction, then it ends up kind of lopsided. And so that's kind of what that oval shape does to your hair proteins. Because it's not perfectly round, they kind of get squunched and lopsided. And so as they come out lopsided, then obviously as that tower of proteins or that tower of 3-ring binders starts to stack, then it kind of starts to lean. And so that's what makes your hair curly. So depending on how oblong and asymmetrical that hair follicle is going to determine how curly it is. So if it's just a little bit oblong and not perfectly symmetrical, but just a little bit, then you're going to have a little bit of curl or a little bit of wave. If it's a super wonky shaped hair follicle, then you're going to end up having super curly hair. And so some of that is genetics. Some of that genetics is more prone in certain ethnicities than others. Again, the genetics determines the shape of your hair follicle, and then the hair follicle determines like what direction your hair grows. And then the color question. Just like you have a protein in your body called melanin. Melanin is what determines the color of your skin. You have melanocytes that is a type of cell in your skin that produces this melanin to just make your skin all the same color. The melanocytes are super stimulated by UV rays, and that's what makes white girls like me tan, because the melanocytes go, oh my gosh, I'm being offended by all this UV, so it'll make more melanin to bring into the skin cells to help protect all the lower layers from the UV exposure. Those melanocytes still live in the skin here by your hair follicles. And so with your hair, there's actually 2 types of melanin. One is called eumelanin, the other one is called pheomelanin. When they name them, I don't know how they came up with those names. It's just the 2 types, and they know that one is light and one is dark. Everybody makes both types. Depending on what ratio you make is going to determine the color of your hair. Eumelanin are your dark melanin proteins. My niece was a hair puller. One area came back curly. Oh my goodness. I have no explanation for that. That's really bizarre. And so eumelanin is the dark protein. Pheomelanin is the light protein. Obviously, the dark is going to override the light, so if you have any amount of the eumelanin, then you're going to have some darkness to your hair. I obviously have a lot of eumelanin because I have very dark hair. All of the shades in between is just different ratios of the 2 types of melanin, the eumelanin and the pheomelanin. With the graying of hair, gray hair actually is what your keratin cells look like with 0 pigment added to them. So as your cells grow and do all this stuff, and you've got the melanocytes here in your in the layer of your skin, as the hair grows, and the melanin and all of the cells get added to it, and because your melanocytes are part of the skin system, that as they die, they're going to fill up with keratin to add to the shaft as the hair grows and the cells multiply down here. So that's how the melanin gets added to the hair. It's not like they're like a little factory and they're just like dropping their little paint in your hair. They're part of that cell system that as they die and they fill up with keratin too, then they're going to be added to the hair shaft as the cells grow and it gets pushed out. So gray hair is actually what that whole system looks like when there is no melanocytes left to add melanin into the hair shaft. It's not like something inside your skin changes colors. It's just that the melanocytes have burned out their life cycle completely, and there's no more melanocytes left near your hair follicles to add color. So thus, your hair may not all gray at one time because it's not like all of your melanocytes die off. It's just different sections may die off and at different rates. And so some people end up with gray streaks. Some people end up with just like a gray section. And so there's not a whole lot you can do. R.I.P. melanocytes. Yeah, that's kind of the thing. As I said earlier, we were talking about somebody said they had white hair, and that's probably not necessarily a lack of melanocytes. And I didn't get to ask all the questions. I don't know if she's still here or not. But we were talking about that with the two types of melanin, the eumelanin and the pheomelanin, if she has zero eumelanin around her hair follicles, then the only thing is going to be that pheomelanin, so it's going to lead to a really white hair or really, really blonde hair. But even when the pheomelanin, why can some people spike their hair without product and some need product? Well, if you go a couple days without washing it and it gets really oily, then you could probably mold it into any kind of shape that you wanted it to be in. Because your hair follicle has the oil glands connected to it, the oil acts as a lubricant to help the hair slide out of the skin, but it also keeps it conditioned. Because again, these cells are dead. They're not going to live, they're not going to reproduce, they're not going to get nutrients anymore. So the only way that they can stay as healthy as possible is to keep the moisture to it. So the oil glands produce oil for the skin and for to keep the moisture added to the hair shaft, because if it gets dry, it gets brittle and that causes it to break. Can it be square? Haven't seen any square ones. Nope. Squares in nature just aren't very efficient. There's a lot of physics that go into determining that, but things with angles aren't very efficient. The thing about being round versus things with angles, circles is the shape that allows everything in the system to be as close to the center as possible. So when it comes to things like gravity, and you think about like big planets formed, gravity holds it in a sphere because a sphere is the geometrical shape that allows everything to get as close to the center as it possibly can. Where having angles means that something is choosing to be farther away than it could be closer if it really wanted to be. So the same thing, when the body's making things into certain shapes, there's very few things that are purposefully square or rectangular when it comes to 3D objects and things like that. Square hair follicles, I think, is a myth. How does texture happen? Very fine versus dry and kinky. Some of it's genetics. Like if you've ever looked at a microscopic picture of hair and it looks like it has scales, the texture is determined by those scales. So if the scales stay nice and flat against the shaft, then obviously when the hair rubs together, there's going to be less friction, and that's what allows hair to be really fine. If the scales splay out more, then you end up with a more coarse texture. Some of it may also have to do with the actual size of the hair follicle. So if you have a small hair follicle, then the shaft that's coming out of it is going to be really skinny versus a wider hair follicle, which then allows more protein to pack in more densely before it comes out, and then you'll have a wider hair follicle or a hair shaft coming out. And a lot of that's just genetics. Can't really change a lot of that. If I could, I would do something else than what I have. So that's kind of the biology of how your hair works and how it grows out of your skin. I will talk to y'all later. Bye!
Thanks for listening to the Pharmacist Answers podcast. The pharmacy is now closed. You can post your questions and comments on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/pharmanswerspod. Or you can email the show at pharmacistanswershere@gmail.com. You can tweet me or message me on Twitter at @SinHendrix. You can find the show notes at pharmacistanswershere.wordpress.com. Pharmacist Answers broadcasts live on Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday at 9:02 a.m. Eastern Time on the Periscope app. You can follow me at SinHendrix or view in your web browser at periscope.tv/SinHendrix. See you next time on the Pharmacist Answers podcast.